The year was 1890, and Chicago was a roar, a giant, hungry beast swallowing up people from every corner of the world. My name's Arthur, and I was just 10 years old, small for my age, but with eyes that missed very little. My pa had brought me here from a quiet farm town in Ohio after Ma went to sleep and didn't wake up. Chicago wasn't quiet. It was iron and steam, shouts and whistles, the constant thrum of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets. And for Pa and me, it became the place where we lived in Mrs. Gable's boarding house, a place that felt more like a giant, creaking puzzle than a home. Mrs. Gable's stood tall and narrow on a side street, not far from the clamor of the stockyards, though far enough that the smell only reached us on certain windy days. It was a dark brick building, 4 stories high with more windows than I could count, most of them draped with heavy, faded velvet curtains that seemed to absorb all the sunlight. The paint on the window frames was peeling like old skin, and the wrought iron railings on the small porch were rusted to a deep, angry orange. A sign, half hidden by a sprawling, sickly ivy, announced Gable's Lodging, rooms for rent. It wasn't welcoming, but Pa said it was cheap, and cheap was what we needed. When we first arrived, Mrs. Gable herself met us at the door. She was a woman built like a brick oven, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Her eyes, sharp and dark, missed nothing, darting from Pa's worn suit to my scuffed boots. Her hair was pulled back so tightly into a bun that it looked like it was trying to escape. She spoke in clipped, dry sentences, her voice like gravel. She seemed to appear and disappear in the shadowy hallways, a silent, watchful presence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. She never smiled, not once, not even when Pa tried to tell a joke about a farmer and a pig. She just blinked, her gaze unwavering. Our room was on the 3rd floor, a small, cramped space with a single window that overlooked a narrow alley filled with overflowing rubbish bins. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the scent of dust, and something else, something cloying and sweet, like old flowers. The wallpaper was a faded pattern of swirling roses, but in the dim light, they looked more like faded bloodstains. The bed, a lumpy cot for me, and a creaking frame for Pa, took up most of the space. Pa tried to make it cheerful, opening the window to let in the grimy city air. But the feeling of unease lingered, clinging to the corners of the room like cobwebs. The boarding house was always full, or so it seemed. Pa said it was because Chicago was growing so fast, and people poured in every day, looking for work in the factories, the meatpacking plants, the endless construction sites. They were a transient lot, most of them. Men who came and went, their faces blurred by the constant flow. There was Mr. Henderson, a quiet tailor with spectacles perched on his nose, who always carried a stack of pattern books. Miss Eleanor, a school teacher who played a tin whistle in the evenings, her melodies thin and reedy in the gloomy hallways. And Mr. O'Malley, a booming Irishman who worked on the railways, his boots perpetually covered in mud. They were the ones who stayed for a few weeks, a month or two, before packing their meager belongings and moving on, leaving behind only the faintest impression, like dust motes in the dim light. But there were others, the ones who stayed for only a day or two. A stern-faced businessman with a leather valise, a young woman with tired eyes and a thin shawl, a grizzled old man with a hacking cough. They would arrive late, their voices hushed, and then, just as silently, they would be gone. I'd sometimes see their names scratched briefly on the chalkboard in the dining hall, then erased by Mrs. Gable's stern hand the next morning. "Moving on, Arthur," Pa would say, shrugging. "That's Chicago for you. People come and go." But it felt like more than that. It felt like they simply vanished, leaving no trace behind, like smoke in the wind. The house itself was a maze. Long, winding hallways that seemed to bend and twist when you weren't looking. stairs that creaked. Differently on each step, some groaning like old men, others sighing like tired women. There were rooms I never saw opened, their doors permanently closed, their keyholes dark and empty. I'd sometimes hear strange sounds from these closed-off parts of the house at night, faint scuttling noises, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls, and sometimes a muffled thud, as if something heavy had fallen in a distant, forgotten corner. Pa said it was just the old house settling, or the city outside, but I knew the sounds were from within, from the hidden depths of Mrs. Gable's boarding house. My favorite place, and also the most unnerving, was the dining hall. It was a large, cavernous room on the ground floor, always dim despite the two tall windows that faced the street. A long, heavy wooden table stretched down its center, scarred with generations of knife marks and spilled food. Mrs. Gable served the meals herself, silent and efficient, placing plates of thick stew or boiled potatoes before us without a word. She never sat with us, always hovering in the doorway, her dark eyes sweeping over the room, watching, always watching. It was in this room that the disappearances felt most real. One evening, Mr. Henderson would be there, quietly stirring his tea. The next, his chair would be empty, his teacup gone, as if he had never existed. No farewells, no goodbyes, just a sudden, profound absence. I'd ask Pa, my voice a small whisper across the table, "Where's Mr. Henderson, Pa?" He'd frown, stir his stew, and say, "Must have found work elsewhere, son." That's how it is. But I knew Mr. Henderson. He was a creature of habit. He never missed a meal. He always finished his tea. And he never left a bookmark in his open book, not if he was truly gone. There was a particular worn copy of Robinson Crusoe that sat on the small shelf in the common room, and its page was perpetually turned down, right where Mr. Henderson had left it. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but for me, it screamed of a sudden, unexplained departure. The number of empty chairs seemed to grow with each passing week. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, like a shadow lengthening in the twilight. A quiet school teacher, a booming railway man, a nervous young clerk. One by one, they would simply cease to appear. Their belongings, a worn coat, a pair of spectacles, a forgotten pipe, would remain in their rooms for a day or two before being tidied away by Mrs. Gable's silent hand. It was as if she was erasing them, not just from the chalkboard, but from existence itself. The very air in the house seemed to grow colder, heavier, filled with the ghost of absent laughter, the echo of forgotten footsteps. And I, Arthur, just 10 years old, was beginning to feel that the roaring city outside was less terrifying than the silence within the walls of Mrs. Gable's boarding house. A silence that was growing day by day with every new disappearance. It was a silence that felt like a growing scream, and I was the only one who seemed to be hearing it. The morning after my unsettling thoughts about Mr. Henderson and his forgotten book, the house felt colder. The air was heavier, thicker with the ghosts of absent faces. At breakfast, the silence in the dining hall was a tangible thing. Broken, only by the clink of spoons on bowls and the creak of the floorboards. The empty chairs at the long table felt like open wounds, each one a stark reminder of a person who was here one day and gone the next. Mrs. Gable, as always, stood in the doorway, her dark eyes sweeping over us, her face a mask of unblinking stone. She was a silent, watchful presence, a shepherd guarding a flock that was steadily dwindling. Just as the meal was ending, a sound broke the silence that was not a sound of the house. It was a loud, cheerful voice from the hallway, a booming laugh that was so out of place it made everyone at the table look up, startled. A new boarder had arrived. He was a tall man, a salesman by the looks of him, with a wide, friendly face and a thick, well-kept mustache. He carried a large leather sample case and was talking a mile a minute to himself, his voice echoing off the gloomy walls. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, a man who sold patent leather boots, and his energy was so powerful it seemed to push the shadows back. He sat at the table, his laughter filling the silent room, and for a moment the house felt a little more alive, a little less menacing. He was a man of optimism, a man who believed in the bright promise of the city, and his presence was a stark, jarring contrast to the quiet dread that had taken root in our home. That afternoon, I decided to do some exploring of my own. I wasn't just a boy with a mind for stories anymore. I was a boy with a growing sense of dread, a boy with a small, terrifying secret that I couldn't share with anyone. I started with the hallways, the long, winding corridors that seemed to twist and turn in the dim light. They were always a labyrinth, a place where a child could get lost, but now they felt more like a maze, a puzzle with a dark and terrifying solution. I noticed new things. A patch of wall on the second floor that seemed to have been recently replastered. The plaster was a lighter color than the rest of the wall, a small white scar in a world of peeling paint and faded roses. I ran my hand over it. It was cold and damp, and it felt like it was hiding something. I also noticed the sound. The low, almost imperceptible hum that I had heard in the night was still there, but now, in the stillness of the afternoon, it was a little louder, a little more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the floor, from the very depths of the house. I pressed my ear to the floorboards, my small body a silent, listening presence in the long, empty hallway. The sound was a low, mechanical thrum, a sound that was both, a vibration and a melody, a sound that made my bones feel hollow and cold. It was not the sound of a house settling. It was the sound of a house that was alive, a house that was breathing, a house that was waiting. I was startled by the sound of a heavy metal grate scraping across a stone floor. The sound came from the end of the hallway, from a part of the house that was always locked, a part of the house that no one ever spoke of. I moved toward the sound, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I saw Mrs. Gable, her back to me, her body a hunched, dark presence in the gloom. She was a woman who was always quiet, but in that moment, her silence was more terrifying than any scream. She was at the door, her hands on a large, rusty key, her head bowed as if listening to something behind the locked door. I couldn't see her face, but I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she was not just listening. She was communicating. She was having a conversation with a world that was hidden, a world that was a secret in the very heart of the boarding house. She finally turned, her dark eyes sweeping the hall, and she saw me. She didn't speak. She didn't scold me. She just stared, her gaze cold and unwavering. And with a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the long, dark hallway, with the sound of the metal grate still ringing in my ears, and the smell of something sweet and cloying in the air. That evening, at dinner, Mr. Davies was a beacon of light in the gloomy room. He was telling a story, a loud, funny story about a man who tried to sell boots to a hog farmer, his booming laugh filling the silent room. Pa even smiled, a rare, weary curve of his lips. It was a moment of normalcy, a moment of light in the ever-deepening darkness of the boarding house. But I couldn't enjoy it. I kept thinking about Mrs. Gable, about the replastered wall, about the strange humming sound, and about the locked door. I kept thinking about the look in her eyes when she saw me, a look that was not of anger, but of a quiet, profound warning. Mr. Davies's chair was empty the next morning. The replastered wall, I noticed, was a little larger now, and the strange, sweet smell in the air was a little stronger. Pa, his face a grim mask, sat at the table, his gaze fixed on the empty chair. "He must have found a better deal," he said, his voice flat. "That's how it is in the city." But I knew the truth. I knew that Mr. Davies, with his booming laugh and His friendly face had not just found a better deal. He had found a secret, a dark and terrible secret in the heart of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, and that secret had swallowed him whole. The number of empty chairs was growing, and I, a small boy with eyes that saw too much, was beginning to feel that the roaring city outside was less terrifying than the silent, malevolent presence within the walls of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, a presence that was steadily growing, one disappearance at a time. The house was not just a puzzle anymore, it was a trap, and I was beginning to feel that I was trapped with it. The disappearance of Mr. Davies, with his booming laugh and his loud, cheerful stories, had a different effect on the boarding house. It was no longer a silent, unspoken dread that hung in the air. It was a tangible, palpable fear, a cold, oppressive presence that made every remaining boarder wary, their eyes darting into the shadows as if expecting to see a phantom. The dining hall, once a place of quiet, dignified silence, was now a place of tense, suspicious silence. We ate our meals quickly, our heads down, our gazes fixed on our plates. No one spoke, no one laughed. The empty chairs at the long wooden table were no longer just empty. They were a tribute, a grim memorial to the men and women who had simply vanished. I started a tally in my head. I'd count the number of empty chairs at dinner, and then I'd count the number of rooms with a closed door on my floor. I was a boy with a mind for numbers and a head full of stories, and this was the most terrifying story I had ever been a part of. The number, in my head, was now 10. 10 people, in the few months we had been here, had simply ceased to exist. 10 people, and the number I knew was growing. One afternoon, a new boarder arrived, a young woman named Clara. She was no older than 17. With eyes that were too big for her face and a constant nervous fluttering of her hands. She was a seamstress, and she had come to Chicago with the bright, terrifying dream of finding work in the city's burgeoning garment factories. But the city had been cold and indifferent, and she had found a home in Mrs. Gable's boarding house, a place that was even more cold and indifferent. She was a gentle, quiet girl, and she reminded me of my ma, with her soft, kind eyes and her small, fragile presence. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved. A silent, fragile moth fluttering in a world of silent, terrifying giants. One evening, as I was sitting on the stairs, she came and sat beside me, her hands twisting in her lap. "This place is not right," she whispered, her voice a small, terrified thread in the silence. "The air, it feels so heavy, and I hear things in the night, faint cries, like a bird with a broken wing." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. I nodded, my throat tight. I knew the things she heard. I knew the sounds of the house. I knew the house was not right, driven by a fear for Clara that was more powerful than any I had known. I began my own real investigation. I was no longer a passive observer. I was a boy with a mission, a boy who had to find a way to stop the silence from growing. I returned to the replastered wall on the second floor, a place I had visited in my mind 1,000 times. This time, I didn't just look at it, I touched it. The plaster was cold and hard, a small white scar in a world of peeling paint and faded roses. I ran my small hands over its surface, and my fingers, with a boy's lack of fear, found a small crack, a tiny, almost invisible fissure in the plaster. I worked a small, chipped thumbnail into the crack, and with a gentle, insistent pressure, a small piece of plaster gave way. The hole was no bigger than my smallest finger, but it was enough. I peered through it, and in the dim light of the hallway, I saw a world that was hidden, a world that was a secret. I saw a small, dark space, a space that was filled with thick, coiling pipes and large metal ducts. The humming sound, I realized, was coming from them. It was a low, mechanical thrum, a sound that was both a vibration and a melody, a sound that made my bones feel hollow and cold. I pulled back from the wall, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had found a piece of the puzzle, a piece of the secret that Mrs. Gable was hiding. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was not a normal boarding house. This was a machine, a terrible silent machine that was hidden behind the walls, a machine that was responsible for the strange humming, the peculiar smells, and the steady, quiet disappearances. Just as I was about to retreat, the sound of a footstep echoed in the hallway. I froze, my small body a knot of pure terror. Mrs. Gable was there, her dark, unblinking eyes fixed on me, on the small hole in the wall. She didn't speak. She didn't scold me. She just stared, her gaze cold and unwavering, and with a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, she placed a finger to her lips, a gesture that was a silent, terrible warning. She turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone, in the long, dark hallway, with the sound of the humming still ringing in my ears, the feel of the plaster dust still on my fingers, and a cold, terrible fear in my heart. That evening at dinner, Clara's chair was empty. Her absence was a silent, profound scream in the tense, silent room. The number of empty chairs was now 11. Pa's face was a grim mask, his eyes filled with a new kind of fear, a fear that was not just for the lost, but for us, for the living. The house was no longer just a place of quiet dread. It was a place of open, terrifying fear. I had found a piece of the puzzle, a piece of the secret. But in doing so, I had also found a terrible truth. That I was now a part of the story, a part of the count, a part of the silent, unblinking tally that was being kept by the house itself. The house was a trap, and I was beginning to feel that I was trapped with it. And the silence, which had been a constant, terrifying question, was now a constant, terrifying threat. The disappearance of Clara was the final, devastating blow to the fragile pretense of normalcy in the boarding house. The fear, which had been a low murmur beneath the surface, now rose to a loud, silent scream. The remaining boarders, a small, weary lot, no longer made small talk or exchanged polite nods. They moved like ghosts in the dark hallways, their eyes darting into the shadows, their faces pale and drawn. We were no longer just a collection of strangers. We were a small, frightened huddle of survivors, each of us a small island of terror, in a vast, silent sea of dread. The dining hall, once a place of quiet dignity, was now a place of profound, terrifying silence, the empty chairs a testament to a truth we were all too afraid to speak. My own fear, a constant cold presence, had now given way to a quiet, boyish resolve. The replastered wall, the low mechanical hum, the strange, sickly sweet smell, these were my new clues. I knew the house was not what it seemed. It was not a home. It was a trap, a machine, and I, a small boy, was the only one who seemed to be able to hear its terrifying, silent song. I decided I had to find another way to see the machine. The replastered wall, I knew, was a lie. There had to be another way in, another way to see the secret that Mrs. Gable was hiding in the very heart of the boarding house. I began my exploration in the attic, a high, dusty room filled with forgotten furniture and old, broken trunks. The air here was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of dust and decay. I moved through the room with a practiced stealth, my small body a silent shadow in a world of silent giants. I found a small, narrow window that overlooked the alley, and from there I could see the back of the house, a dark brick wall with a series of small, strange openings. They were not windows, nor were they vents. They were small, square openings covered by a heavy metal grate, and from them a faint metallic smell seemed to emanate. I knew with a certainty that went beyond words that this was the machine. This was the house's secret, a terrible hidden heart that was beating in the depths of the building. As I was watching, I heard a new sound, a sound that was not of the house. It was the sound of a carriage, a horse's hooves on the cobblestone street below, a sound that was both a promise and a terrifying, new kind of threat. I moved to the front window and looked down. A man was getting out of the carriage. He was not a boarder. He was a man of the city, a man of authority with a long dark coat and a top hat. He was a detective. My heart, which had been a cold, heavy stone in my chest, suddenly leapt with a wild, desperate hope. He was a man of logic, a man of the law. He would see the truth. He would save us. I watched as he spoke to Mrs. Gable, a small, grim figure at the front door. He was a man who believed in facts, in evidence, in the clear, concise truth of the world. But Mrs. Gable was a master of deceit. She was a woman who could make a lie sound like the truth. A woman who could make an absence feel like a normal part of life. I watched as she spoke, her hands gesturing calmly to the empty rooms, her voice a low, steady murmur. She was telling him a story of a city that was a place of constant motion, a story of people who came and went, of men and women who simply moved on to a new life, a new job, a new city. The detective listened, his face a mask of polite professional skepticism, but I could see that he was a man who believed in the order of things, a man who saw the world in simple, practical terms. He finally turned to leave, his face a grim mask of disappointment. He was a man who had not found the truth, and his failure was a heavy weight on all of our shoulders. But as he turned, something caught my eye. It was on his long, dark coat, a small, dark stain. It was not a stain of mud or dirt. It was a stain that was a deep, dark red, and it seemed to thrum with a faint, otherworldly light. I had seen it before. It was the same color as the lilies in my garden in my old home, a color that was a deep, sullen red, the color of blood. It was a stain from the house, a stain from the machine, a stain from a world that was a wound in the very fabric of our lives. The detective, a man of logic and reason, a man who believed in the order of things, had been touched by the house. He was no longer a man who was looking for the truth. He was a man who had become a part of the story, a man who had become a part of the tally. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, a small, grim figure, her dark eyes fixed on the retreating carriage, her face a mask of triumph. She had not just defeated him. She had defeated his world, his logic, his very existence. She had claimed him, a silent, terrible victory that no one would ever know. The house was not just a trap. It was a living, breathing thing, a predator that chose its prey with a quiet, terrible precision. The detective's arrival, which should have been a moment of hope, was now a moment of chilling, profound fear. He had been so close, and yet he had been so far. And I, a small boy with a terrible secret, was now the only one who saw the truth. The house was a step ahead of them, all, and it was waiting for me. The carriage wheels clattered on the cobblestones, the sound a small, fragile echo in the vast, silent sea of the boarding house. The detective was gone, a man of law and logic swallowed by a lie that was now a silent, tangible, terrifying truth. My heart, a wild drum in my chest, hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that was a testament to the knowledge I now held. The house was not a home. It was a trap, a predator that chose its prey with a quiet, terrible precision. The detective, with his long, dark coat and his professional skepticism, was just the latest in a long line of victims. A man who had come to seek the truth and had become a part of the story, a part of the tally. I ran to our room, my small body a silent shadow in the long, dark hallway. I was no longer a child with a story. I was a boy with a secret, a terrible, profound secret that I could no longer keep to myself. Pa was there, sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, a man who had seen a giant humbled, a man who had been a silent witness to a terrible, profound lie. He was a man of the earth, a man who believed in simple truths, and the world had just become a place of dark and terrible secrets, secrets that he could not comprehend. "Pa," I whispered, my voice a small, terrified thread in the silence. He looked up, his face a pale, grim mask, his eyes filled with a more profound kind of fear, a fear that was not for himself, but for me. "Arthur," he said, his voice a low, tortured murmur. "What is happening here?" I knew. He had seen the lie. He had seen the truth. He had seen the house swallow a man of law, a man of authority, a man who should have been our salvation. I took his hand, my small hand a trembling anchor in his, and I led him to the wall, the replastered wall that was a small white scar in, a world of peeling paint and faded roses. I showed him the hole, the small, almost invisible fissure in the plaster that was a window into a world of secrets. He knelt, his large, calloused hand reaching out to touch the cold, damp plaster. He put his ear to the wall, his face a mask of intense concentration, and he heard it, the low, mechanical thrum. The sound was not just a sound. It was a vibration. That seemed to be speaking to the deepest parts of his soul, a sound that was both a melody and a vibration, a sound that made his bones feel hollow and cold. He pulled back, his face a mask of profound, uncomprehending terror. He was a man who had lived his life in a world of simple truths, a world of crops and seasons, a world of logic and reason, and the world had just become a place of dark and terrible secrets, a place that he could not comprehend. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice a small, terrified gasp. "It's a machine, Pa," I said, my voice a small, trembling thread. "A terrible machine. It's the heart of the house. It's alive." The words, which in a normal world would have been the ramblings of a child, were in this world a terrifying, profound truth. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love, and he knew. He knew I was not just a child with a story. I was a witness. Just then, a voice, a low, quiet murmur, broke the silence. "He was a fool to come here," the voice said. "He was a man who believed in the order of things. He should have known that some things have no order. Some things have no law." It was Mrs. Gable. She was standing in the doorway, a silent, dark figure in the gloom, her face a mask of triumph. She was not a landlady, she was a guardian. She was not a woman, she was a silent, powerful partner to the house. She had not just heard us, she had been watching us. She had been listening to us. She was a silent, malevolent presence, a woman who had a secret and a story that was a wound in the very fabric of our lives. Pa, his face a mask of profound, terrifying terror, stood up, his body a trembling testament to his enduring will to live. "What have you done?" he said, his voice a low, strangled whisper. Mrs. Gable did not answer. She just stood there, her dark, unblinking eyes fixed on us, her face a mask of cold, unwavering calm. "The house needs to be fed," she said, her voice a low, quiet murmur, a voice that was both a melody and a vibration, a voice that made my bones feel hollow and cold. "The house must be fed. It must be full." Pa looked at her, his face a mask of uncomprehending terror, and then he looked at me. He was a man who believed in action over despair. He was a man who believed in the order of things, and the world had just become a place of dark and terrible secrets, a place that he could not comprehend. He knew that they were no longer just living in a boarding house. They were living in a tomb, and they were the next to be counted. The chapter will end with their desperate decision to flee, a small, terrified family trying to escape, a predator that has already claimed 50 souls. The number of missing people, which had been a quiet, terrifying question, was now a constant, terrifying threat. They were no longer just living in a boarding house. They were living in a tomb, and they were the next to be counted.